Oh, hello ladies and gentlemen, Big Daddy Man Hat here, and today on this channel, as you probably noticed from the video title, we shall be discussing which is better, the iPad or the Nintendo Switch. And yes, I know that title may in fact probably annoy many of you, as you're probably thinking those are two completely different kinds of devices and they are not comparable in the slightest. Top Hat Gaming Man may as well be making a video on which is better, the colour pink or a snow. Just two things that aren't particularly related. But personally I disagree with you, as both the iPad and the Nintendo Switch are two handheld devices in which you can use for gaming today. Before I move forward, when I say iPad, what I really mean is Android and iOS devices in general. I suppose it's similar to back in the day when all old people used to refer to any games console as Nintendo, which also begs the question of if I'm getting old myself now. Oh dear, oh dear. So let's go back in time a little bit. Let's go to the mid 1990s and even the early 90s, I would say. There was one undisputed most popular electronic device in which people would game on, and in fact I have one right here, the Nintendo Game Boy. You used to see these little buggers everywhere. Everywhere I used to go, I used to see people playing these Nintendo Game Boys. I used to see people playing them at school. I used to see people playing them at the airport. I used to see people playing them on the park. I used to even see people play these things in their own homes for some bizarre reason, because personally I wouldn't have done that. But no, people did. I can tell you that for sure. The Nintendo Game Boy was cheap, it was simplistic, it was the handheld in which everybody wanted to own and procure. For this reason, Nintendo dominated the handheld market for quite some time. The Game Boy Color did fantastically, the Game Boy Advance done even better, and to top it all off, the Nintendo DS eclipsed any of their previous handheld units. So throughout this period, everywhere I looked, I would see people gaming on Nintendo handhelds. These little buggers were everywhere. But then we got the Nintendo 3DS era come along. Still, there was a lot of people gaming on Nintendo devices, but these things were nowhere near as prevalent as they once had been. I noticed instead people were gaming on other devices. A lot of the time using simple Android devices and playing stuff like Candy Crush Saga and very simplistic games. So now we are in the era of the Nintendo Switch. I cannot see the platform selling nearly as well as any of the previous examples, purely as everywhere I look now, I very rarely see children using Nintendo devices at all. Every time I look at them, they're using iOS devices, Android devices, tablets usually. So, when people refer to Nintendo as the market leaders in handheld gaming, I suppose it also comes down to how you actually define what handheld gaming is today. Obviously Nintendo are the market leaders when it comes to releasing devices which are bespoke and purposely made for just gaming on the go, but then again that's pretty much quite an archaic concept, isn't it? Like if you're going to have a device to game on the go, surely you want to do more than just gaming these days. There's so many more things you can do with devices. Like if you want a device for gaming, you would at least expect it to do some really simple things like run the YouTube app, let you browse the internet, have a Facebook app, have a Twitter app. It's not really a lot to ask, is it? And the Nintendo Switch so far does not do any of those things. And the reason in which I have heard it doesn't function in this way is due to the old-fashioned Nintendo hating piracy bullcrap. The same reason the Nintendo 64 was gimped with its poor cartridge technology to protect themselves from piracy. The same reason the GameCube offered their inferior storage system with those tiny little DVDs, once again to protect them from piracy. Nintendo consistently push out these devices which are limited in capability sometimes, specifically just to protect them from piracy. Pretty bizarre behaviour really, but I'm going a little bit off track now. So the point I was trying to get to was basically just to state that Nintendo are only the market leaders in handheld gaming if we are specifically looking at devices which only handle handheld gaming. If we are looking at other devices which can do other things other than gaming, then there are many devices which people game on which are a lot more successful than the Nintendo Switch. iOS and Android devices are so impressive these days in terms of the sales they pump out, you would have even noticed Nintendo themselves becoming a third-party publisher on those platforms. You can get Nintendo games now on iOS and Android because even Nintendo themselves know they cannot compete with these platforms whatsoever, which is why the Nintendo Switch, which I have right here, is so vastly different to those platforms and so vastly different to the Nintendo Game Boy. They are trying to find a niche in the market, something what's completely different to what's already out there, as they know they cannot compete with the big boys any longer. Personally, I find it really difficult to think of the Nintendo Switch as a continuation within the lifeline of the Game Boy, because the two platforms are so very different in what they offer. As I said earlier, the Game Boy offered a very simplistic, cheap way in which you could play games, much like what you get on iOS and Android devices today. The cheap pick up and play, on the go way of playing games. So if anything, the iPad is closer to the spiritual successor of the Game Boy than Nintendo's own line of products. So thinking about this, where does this leave the Nintendo Switch? I would say it puts it on the losing end of the spectrum to the devices which were less convenient than what the Game Boy offered. So the less convenient options in the Game Boy at the time were the high-end, expensive handhelds. Platforms like the Sega Game Gear, the Atari Lynx, and this. The Turbo Graphics I'm getting my words right up. The Turbo Express / PC Engine GT, depends what region you live in. So for NEC, there was no way in which they could compete with the Game Boy and its amazing simplicity. So instead they decided to take a different route and released a high-end handheld gaming platform. Basically a device where you could play your home console games from your Turbo Graphics 16 on the go on your Turbo Express. Now, where does this sound familiar today? It's just like the Nintendo Switch, isn't it? Where Nintendo have had to release a high-end gaming device what's completely different from other platforms on the market just to stand out. So overall, the NEC Turbo Express was a massive commercial failure, and it just couldn't compete with the cheap, simplistic nature of the Game Boy. Everybody had them, similar to which everyone has iPads now. So I'm not going to make a claim as outrageous as the Nintendo Switch is going to fail just as badly as the Express, because sales have already proved otherwise. However, I will say that we will never ever see as many Nintendo Switches in children's hands as we do Android or iOS devices. It's never ever going to happen. So that's why Nintendo have been happy just to settle for a niche. We saw a very similar thing happen within console gaming a few years back as well. There is a reason they published the Nintendo Wii, because essentially they decided they could no longer compete with Microsoft or Sony. So instead they diversified and found a niche. That's exactly what's happened with handheld gaming now. They know they can no longer get away with creating a nice simple device like the Game Boy, so they've had to diversify and they are trying the high end of handheld gaming. The complete opposite of which Gunpei Yokoi likes to do with handheld gaming consoles with the company in the past. So with regards to the question posed in the title of this video, is the iPad better than the Nintendo Switch? I would suppose it depends on which lens you would look through when answering this question. The iPad certainly offers a lot more entertainment mediums than simply gaming. You can browse online, you can look at Facebook, Twitter, etc. I can see why any sensible child would prefer to own an iPad over a Nintendo Switch any day of the week. But when it comes to gaming specifically, or more importantly, high-end gaming, the Nintendo Switch has your back covered. So overall, I would say the iPad is a much more well-rounded product, which you can do a lot more with, which is, as I've said, why Nintendo have decided to take the route of simply finding a niche rather than trying to compete directly with it. So I think when you really look at things, Nintendo are biting and scratching for survival at the moment, which is why they have changed so much and have decided to release the Nintendo Switch. I can never see a period where Nintendo will sell as many units with their handheld devices as they once did in the past. However, the Switch still to this day fills a small niche within the handheld market as perhaps the #1 device for high-end handheld gaming. So ladies and gentlemen, let me know in the comment section if you believe Nintendo will ever reach the same heights they once were at when it comes to handheld gaming. Will Nintendo ever shift as many units on a handheld platform as they did on the Nintendo DS or the Game Boy ever again? Because personally, I think they are going to slowly shrink and shrink, finding smaller and smaller niches within gaming. Anyway, let us know all about this in the comment section. Cheerio!